Good evening. I'm Steve Weberg. I'm in the public affairs staff of the Kansas City Public Library here, and I really want to thank all of you for being with us this evening. Everybody here down at our downtown central library, and those of you who are watching via live stream. We're in now our 18th year of signature programming at the library, which we launched in 2006 to further the informational and educational mission of the library and to promote civic engagement. Tonight, we emphasize all of those elements. We are, of course, nearly 4 weeks into the horror that now grips the Middle East. It was sometime in the days after October 7th, and my wife and I were watching news accounts of events, and she turned to me and she asked, "How well do you understand what this is all about?" And I had to tell her, not well enough. And that answer is almost certainly too common. And perhaps that's understandable. To fully understand this crisis, we have to look back centuries back. And that's what tonight is about. It's about the library trying to promote a better understanding of the history of the region to aid you in understanding what is happening in the region today. So to do that, we turn to John Hostler and Brian Steed, both eminent scholars and historians on Middle East matters. Both are familiar to library audiences. Between them, they've spoken here 14 previous times as part of our long-standing partnership with the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. We reached out to John and Brian not because of that partnership and not because of their affiliation with the Command and General Staff College, but again, because of their credentials as historians and their ability to lay out an informational, hopefully instructional foundation for what we're now sadly seeing, hearing, and reading out of the Middle East. John Hostler is a professor of military history at the Command and General Staff College, where he's taught since 2017. He's an expert on medieval warfare in Europe and the Near East, and he's the author or editor of 7 books, including Jerusalem Falls, 7 Centuries of War and Peace, released late last year, in which he'll draw from in part tonight. John holds a doctorate in European history from the University of Delaware. He's a trustee of the U.S. Commission on Military History. He's a fellow of the British-based Royal Historical Society and past president of De Re Militari, did I say that correctly? The Society for Medieval Military History. Brian Steed has taught at the Command and General Staff College since 2013. He's an associate professor of military history and is an internationally acclaimed and very much sought after speaker on a number of subjects, including all things Middle East. A retired Army Lieutenant Colonel, Brian served as a Middle East foreign officer, living and working there for 8.5 years, as an exchange officer with the Jordanian Armed Forces, as a liaison to the Israel Defense Forces, and as an advisor and analyst in Iraq, seeing from all sides the hostilities that afflict the region. He's written or edited 9 books, the latest of them released in June, Voices of the Afghanistan War, Contemporary Accounts of Daily Life, which Brian co-edited with his wife, Sherry. Now, as always, we're leaving time, and this is important, for Q&A after the presentation. To help John and Brian prepare for this program and help them better understand what public questions and concerns are out there, we solicited questions in advance through our social media channels and already have received a number of very good questions. And now, those of you watching online, you can submit your own questions through our YouTube live chat box. And those of you here at the library can submit questions in writing, starting about halfway through John's and Brian's presentation. Several of my colleagues and I will have note cards and pencils that we'll distribute, and then we'll collect those questions from you, and John and Brian will get to as many of those questions as they can. So again, thank you so much for being here. Now please join me in welcoming John Hostler and Brian Steed.
Okay, it is an honor to be back here. I really enjoy this audience.
To be the moral authority occupational forces there. You enable their violence. We, Palestinians, are not historic relics. To your ability as a medieval historian, I am a Palestinian. I get to speak on my behalf. I get to speak. We are here. We are in Kansas City. Our families are the ones dying. Our families are the ones getting killed. It's our communities, and they're treating us like relics of the past. End the genocide.
You're not helping your cause.
We understand, ma'am. We understand all the emotions. We would ask just that you listen to these gentlemen, and we are going to stick around afterwards. We'll all stay afterwards. You can speak to us, and you can speak with John, and you can speak with Brian.
Institutionalized silence of Palestinian voices is violence. Palestinians and their ability to speak on their own behalf.
We're not coming here to listen to you. Well, prove it.
Okay. Well,
Institutionalized silence of Palestinian voices is violence.
this is an informational session, and we just ask that you listen. And if you hear anything that you don't like,
It is biased. It is skewed. Look at the pictures on the screen. Whose tears do you see on the screen? Only one side. Where are the Palestinians who are grieving? What grief is that? That's destruction wrought by violence. I get to tell you about Palestinian grief. Me, who lost 30 members on Wednesday. 30 members of my family in the Gaza Strip were killed by an Israeli airstrike. That ain't right. Feeling grief, feeling rage, feeling pain, continuing to speak.
We know. Now sit down and leave.
You want me to sit down and not speak on behalf of the citizens of my family who was killed on Wednesday?
Go around.
We came to hear the speaker, not
ma'am, we've let you speak here for a little while. We just ask now that you listen to them. We are going, ma'am, please listen to me. We are going to.
Ceasefire now! 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 Ceasefire now!
70
Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now! Ceasefire now!
Ma'am, again, we've now given you some time, and we will give you more time afterwards. We've listened to you. We're just asking you to listen to them. And this is inform.
30 members of my family on Wednesday. I don't care whether you're See, you don't care about Palestinians. You enable and continue to enable racism and ethnobasism in a state, and you continue to allow that to perpetuate the United States society. And we send $3.8 billion a year to Israel for military aid, to bomb children, to kill mothers, to kill fathers, to trap them underneath rubble of buildings. We send $3.8 billion a year, and now they're asking for more. Now they're asking for $14 billion more dollars.
That ain't right.
Instead, fund your library so that people can actually learn, and you can have more exposés about banned books, and talk about how you don't silence voices. Well, these are the productions that you're putting on.
But, ma'am, you haven't seen the production. You haven't seen the presentation yet. We just ask that you see and listen.
Bring the police.
Library owns the security.
Whoever the hell you are, sir, enabler of violence, Brian Steed, look at the faces of Palestinians before you try and tell us about violence and the unbiased education that you're going to try and give. Talk about the 75 years of occupation. Talk about the 10,000 Palestinians who have been killed in the Gaza Strip alone, and the hundreds who have been killed in the West Bank in the last few weeks alone by armed
And Hezbollah.
by armed crazy lunatics
As the
engaged
granddaughter
in
of Holocaust
white.
survivors, Israel and the West using Jewish people as pawns to support their war crimes and genocide, it is anti-Semitic and violent. Israel is a state built on ethnic cleansing and the genocide of the Palestinian people. Israel is an apartheid state. All right, ma'am, please, can I get a word? Can I get a? All right, here's what we'll do. We'll not be able to proceed tonight in this forum, unfortunately. So we still want to bring this information to you, and we are going to go to another part of the library. We thank you all for coming tonight. We will carry on this program. We will record it. It will be placed on our YouTube website for you to view first thing tomorrow. Thank you all for coming, and we're finished here tonight.
Okay. Well, one, I always appreciate working with the Kansas City Public Library. It is a great opportunity to be in this venue again, even though this is a little unusual situation. So I want to start with an analogy that I regularly use when talking to students or to military professionals and they interact with foreign cultures. I use this analogy of a pyramid, and so the idea is that if you're standing immediately beneath the pyramid and you look up, the shape you see is a square. But if you're standing off to the side of the pyramid, the shape you probably see is a triangle. Now, neither the square nor the triangle is an accurate description of the pyramid, but nor is either one of them less accurate than the other. So a square is just as legitimate a way to see the pyramid as is a triangle, and a triangle is no more wrong in its interpretation of the pyramid as is a square. And the challenge here tonight, what I'm hoping that we do, is sort of give perspectives, both the square and the triangle. Now, the ideal world would be we get people to see the entire pyramid. I've learned over years of experience with this, that's very, very difficult, probably not going to get there, but what I hope is that those who are watching this will come to appreciate more of the shape than just their square or triangular perspective that they began this with. So, what happened? On 7 October 2023, we saw a lot of events regarding an attack from the Gaza Strip into southern Israel. Now, what has garnered the nation and the world's attention since then has been both those events and the response to them. Now, one of the things I would say that we do, particularly in America, is we mistake how we look at conflict. And so this is my tree and roots of conflict. So for Americans, what we regularly do is we focus on the tree of conflict. And we focus on what happened on 7 October and the events immediately preceding it and then immediately following. What I would suggest in the Middle East, that the people who live there, they don't see the tree of conflict so much. What they see, or what they focus on more, are the roots of conflict. And as we talk in this presentation tonight, what you're going to hear, I think, are both discussions on what I call the roots of conflict and then the deep roots of conflict. And the dividing line between those two tends to be World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So John Hostler is going to talk tonight more about the deep roots of conflict, and he's going to connect them up to the conflict itself, whereas I'm going to talk more about those roots of conflict that are a little shallower and more recent, but also important. The other point I want to make is this aspect of story. Every society that goes to war has a story about the war, and every society has a story about how they interact with the world and how they interact with their neighbors. What I hope people listening to this realize is that there is disagreement about every aspect of the elements of story. There's disagreement about who the characters are. There's disagreements about the plot. There's disagreements about the setting. These are things that matter. It's part of what makes this so intransigent, that both sides cannot even interpret things, or both sides interpret things radically differently. And so there are almost no things that they agree on in terms of they're both seeing a triangle or they're both seeing a square on that particular issue. It's always radical different perspectives. And what we're hoping to provide is some level of appreciation of those different perspectives so that people can then appreciate what they're seeing. And so if you're watching this and you have an immediate reaction toward one of these perspectives, like you think that it's all about the Palestinians and their suffering, or you think it's all about the Israelis and their suffering, what I hope to do is I hope for you to appreciate a little bit more that different perspective. and just recognize it's not as simple as the headlines sort of project on this issue. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Hausler.
Thank you, Dr. Steed. So most historical treatments of the modern Arab-Israeli conflict tend to start with the late 19th and early 20th century. However, the roots of this conflict, as my colleague indicated, extend much farther back in time than that. And I would argue that the modern situation is still being conditioned on the basis of the distant past. And the distant past is as controversial and conflicted as the current day events. So what I'd like to do tonight is try to attempt an objective exploration of those different views of the pyramid, of pre-modern historical claims made on the one hand by Jewish communities and made on the other hand by Muslim communities. So what we'll do to accomplish that is first examine their respective narratives about one important thing, the land itself. What is the land and who has a claim to it? Second, we'll look at the history of holy sites, particularly in the city of Jerusalem, where also different sides have claims. And I hope by laying out that history, we can get some kind of understanding of two, what I would call, very defensible and very credible historical stories. And at the end, I'll offer my thoughts on what this all means in the current conflict, vis-a-vis Hamas, the State of Israel, and the Middle East peace process in general. So first, to start with, we're talking about the land. Both Muslims and Jews claim an indigenous past and former political control over the Middle East. Both of these claims hold up very roundly to scrutiny. So we'll start with the Jewish claim. The land of Canaan for the Jews was the physical, spiritual, religious, and political birthplace of the Jewish people during Old Testament times and persisting after those times through foreign conquests over the course of 16 centuries. However, the last Jewish government in power left power in 37 BC, before the State of Israel in the 20th century. And that's when the Roman Republic subjugated the region. Any local governance was destroyed in the Roman responses afterwards to the zealot revolts that popped up in the 1st through the 2nd centuries, especially the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century AD under the Emperor Hadrian, in which hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. Persecution of the Jews then continued under Roman rule, even after the empire shifted to Christianity in the 4th century. As Jewish communities tried to reestablish themselves in urban centers, the oppression continued, most notably during the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius in the 7th century, and again during the Crusades in the 11th through the 13th centuries. Some periods, on the other hand, saw gradual, piecemeal restoration of Jewish rights under Christian rule, under the rule of the Muslim Ayyubids, the Muslim Mamluks, and the Muslim Ottomans. And I'll talk about those in a few minutes. But in any case, Jerusalem's claim to the land, the Jewish claim to the land is that Jews maintained a continual indigenous existence in the region despite the absence of political power. They once held it and they lost it, but that they were always there. As evidenced by Jewish communities not only in Jerusalem, but also population centers like Tyre, Caesarea, etc., etc. So that's the Jewish claim to the land that goes sort of way back. Now we'll look at the Muslim claim to the land, which is an equally great story. Formal Arabic control of the territory of the Levant arrived much later than the Jews in the 7th century AD. Now, capitalizing on Byzantine weakness on its southern flank, the Rashidun caliphs sent armies from Arabia into Palestine, Syria, and Persia in the 630s. Those wars were largely successful. In fact, they were incredibly successful. And they were managed to take down not only part of the Byzantine Empire, but all of the Persian Empire at basically the same time. These caliphs governed the territories until the assassination of the 4th caliph, whose name was Ali, in 661 AD. Now thereafter followed a number of Muslim ruling polities. First the Umayyads and then the Abbasid caliphates, who more or less dominated the region with little interference for about 4 centuries. Serious Muslim infighting, however, was sparked in the 10th century. And this is where things start to change a little bit, with the rise of a rival caliphate in Egypt known as the Caliphate of the Fatimids. This is a Shia caliphate, and they came into conflict with the Sunni communities around them. After the Shia come in and take power in Egypt and eventually get control over Jerusalem, you have a broad response by the Turkish influences in the region, most notably the Seljuk Turks in the 11th century. And the history of these intra-Islamic struggles is it's long, it's very complicated. There are lots of small splinter groups that are involved as well. And so as you see on my slide where I've got the general dynasties, those are big generalizations that try to capture the essential thrust of the period. But the point is that you have Sunni and Shia alternatively working together and sometimes fighting against each other. Now, it's in the period from the 11th to the 13th century that the principal and really best remembered invaders come in from outside the region, and these are the Crusaders. In the year 1099, the army of the First Crusade arrives at the city of Jerusalem, sacks the city, and massacres the local Muslim and Jewish population. Those Muslims who aren't killed are exiled from town, and those Jews that aren't killed are ransomed back to their families in Egypt, if indeed they have them. Following the sack of Jerusalem, you have the establishment of 4 so-called Crusader states, Latin entities in the Levant, and these survive in pieces until the end of the 13th century. But the Muslim world remembers 2 pivotal moments where these Crusader states were defeated by Islamic armies. The first one was the jihad of the famous Sultan Saladin in the 1180s. Destroyed the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin and recaptured the city of Jerusalem in 1187. And then finally, the finishing stroke by the Egyptian Mamluks in 1291. Right? And that is the end of the formal presence of Christian states in the Latin East. Right? They moved to the island of Cyprus, they moved to the island of Rhodes, but the idea is they're being driven off. Right? Now, after that, there was another threat. And we tend to forget about this one, but it looms very large in the Muslim consciousness. The threat of the Mongols from the east. The Mongol various khanates are spreading across the world. The one in the Near East is that of the Ilkhanate, and it's pushing and probing towards the Levant in the 13th century. But the Egyptian Mamluks are able to defeat it at 2 pivotal battles. First, the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, and then the Battle of Homs in 1281. And by the time those are wrapped up, the Mongol Ilkhanate push into the Middle East is essentially over. The Muslims have reasserted their presence in that land. After that, you have the Ottoman Empire and a lot of history that doesn't really, you don't really have many foreign incursions until you get to a guy named Napoleon, once you get to the French Revolution. And eventually, after that, in the 20th century, the Allies in World War I. So we have to step back and say, what does this mean, these land claims? I would say it's evident that we have 2 complementary historical narratives. Neither one is wrong. Both center on the acquisition of territory and cities in Israel and Palestine. Both complain about victimization by oppressive foreign states coming in from outside. Both of these complaints are legitimate. You can track the outside invaders and see the suffering of the indigenous people on both sides of the coin. The main difference between them is that the Muslim presence persisted by way of successful military campaigns while they were in power, while Jewish presence remained in spite of those military campaigns, in spite of disasters, pogroms, forced conversions, and baptisms, right? But both of them persisted. And better yet, from my perspective, both of these narratives are largely defensible via the historical record. They rest on sound scrutiny of documents, and most scholars of these events would agree on the broad contours of the narratives. So that's the claim to the land. Now let's move to the second point, which is about the holy sites. Okay? It's another one of the roots that my colleague here talked about, right? The existence and ownership of holy sites, in particular in the city of Jerusalem. And this concerns really the Temple Mount, or Al-Haram al-Sharif, depending on what you like to call it. That is contested ground in the city because both Jews and Muslims claim some piece of that particular plateau in the city. Okay? So first, the Jewish claims. The claim is that in the 10th century BC, Solomon built the Jewish temple on Mount Moriah in the center of the city of Jerusalem, which at that time was the Jewish capital. Right? Now, that temple was destroyed by the Chaldeans in the 6th century. It was rebuilt during the time of Ezra in the 5th century, and then it was improved upon and greatly enlarged during the reign of Herod the Great in the 1st century. Right? So you have different structures on that piece. That temple was eventually destroyed by the Romans, and again, there's that foreign power coming in, right? and then built over in the 2nd century when the Romans essentially built a colony on top of the Temple Mount called Aelia Capitolina, built a temple to Jupiter on the site, and the Jewish holy site was rendered gone. And because, as I mentioned in the Bar Kokhba revolt, most of the Jews had been eliminated in warfare, it ceases to be an important place of Jewish commingling, and they stopped coming there. The remains of the temple, however, remain venerated today, with Jews praying at the western wall, which is on the southwestern edge of the Temple Mount. It can be argued that Jews have been praying at that western wall since the mid to late 12th century, during the period of the Crusader states. In fact, we have some very famous people who did it, including the philosopher Maimonides, who supposedly came to Jerusalem and prayed at the wall then. This appears to have been an accommodation made by the Latin kings of Jerusalem, which is interesting because you have a Christian king giving Jews the rights to pray in a city that the Christians had taken by conquest. Before that, what we think is that the Jews were praying not at the western wall, but from the Mount of Olives to the east. They would go up the mountain and pray in the direction of the old temple. And then in the 12th century, they're outside the temple itself. Now, the story really gets interesting with the Muslim reconquest of Jerusalem under Saladin in 1187. We know that there were Jews in the city before Saladin, but once Saladin takes the city back, Jews are going to be welcomed back in bigger numbers. And you start to see masses of Jews taking pilgrimages to Jerusalem in the 13th century. The most famous is something called the Aliyah of the 300, which were 300 rabbis who traveled from Provence to Jerusalem in the year 1209, 1210. And they're coming to pray at the Western Wall and to rebuild the synagogues in the city. From that point forward, Jewish residents are there, Jewish visitors are there, and they're all praying at the wall. In 1546, the area has come under the rule of the Ottoman sultans, and here's the most fascinating piece of all. The famous Ottoman warrior Suleiman the Magnificent, who is one of these big names in terms of driving back Christian armies in the 16th century, in 1546 he issues a decree known as a firman that guarantees the Jews the right to pray at the Western Wall in perpetuity. That's from a Muslim Ottoman sultan extending that right to the Jewish people. This right persisted all the way up until 1949, when access was temporarily blocked by the Kingdom of Jordan, and then it was reestablished in 1967 after the Six-Day War, and it's remained in force ever since. So if you add it all up, Jews have about 800 years of tradition of praying at the Western Wall, the remains of the temple, their holy site in Jerusalem. So that's the Jewish story. Now let's move to the Muslim story. The mainline Muslim belief is that the Temple Mount was host to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the Isra, and his ascension to heaven, the Miraj, in the year 621, they think. Now in 638, after Muhammad's death, the Rashidun armies are going to move from Arabia into Palestine and Syria, and Jerusalem will fall in the year 638. It will be surrendered in an agreement. Okay? The caliph who takes the city, Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, very famous person in Islamic history, makes a deal with the governor of Jerusalem, the local patriarch. And that deal is this: Christians can keep their holy sites in the city, but Muslims would get exclusive access to the Temple Mount. And the patriarch at the time says, what do we Christians care about the Temple Mount? Nothing. You can go ahead and have it. We were using it as a garbage heap anyway. Right? Umar is then going to order the first construction of a mosque on the Temple Mount. Now that mosque is not going to survive. Our indications are it was probably made of wood and it was hastily built. But eventually it will be replaced by a mosque that does survive, known as Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest mosque in Islam after the mosques in Mecca and Medina. Okay? That mosque is built and rebuilt over the centuries because Jerusalem suffers through several earthquakes. And you can track them in the record. Earthquake takes down part of the wall, they rebuild it. Earthquake comes back, they rebuild it, etc., etc. But the point is that from 638 forward, you have Muslims praying on the Temple Mount. Muslim prayer there has been more or less continuous ever since. There's only been 2 real breaks in Muslim prayer on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The first one, no surprise, goes back to the period of the Crusades. After the Crusaders take the city in 1099, I mentioned that they exile or massacre most of the Muslims in town, right? We think that those Muslims are gone for about 20 years. It could be actually a little less. That's before you start seeing Muslim merchants come back into the city. By the time you get to the 1140s, so about 40 years after the First Crusade ends, Muslims are back praying on the Temple Mount. Now, they're not praying in the Mosque of Al-Aqsa because that's being used as the headquarters for the Knights Templar. But they're praying right outside Al-Aqsa to the west, and they're praying outside of Al-Aqsa to the north. And we have the names of principals who are praying there, and you might think, well, those are elites, they have special accommodations. But we also have reference to groups of Muslims praying on the Mount. Right? So even after the First Crusade, Muslim prayer is restored fairly rapidly. The other break is going to come in the 13th century, but there's something interesting that happens with that, and that's in the year 1229. A real seminal moment. During the Sixth Crusade, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II acquires the city of Jerusalem via a treaty with the Egyptian Sultan. They nail out an agreement between themselves, and it's essentially this. The city will belong to the Christians, and Christians have rights to their holy spaces within it. But Frederick II, again, the Holy Roman Emperor, the very Christian Holy Roman Emperor, makes the agreement that the Temple Mount itself will be exclusively for Muslim worship. And you end up in another interesting place here. Just like when Christians were granting Jews the right to pray at the Western Wall, you have Christians granting Muslims the exclusive right to pray on the Temple Mount. Right? That arrangement holds for the 10 years after Frederick II. It takes a little break in the year 1239, in 1243 that we need to talk about. And this is the second and last major break of Muslim prayer in the history of the city. In the year 1243, the Sultan of Egypt, a different one now, had hired a mercenary group from Central Asia known as the Khwarezmians. This is a Muslim zealot group. They're known as terrifying fighters, and they hire on this band to help them fight some wars. These Khwarezmians are so zealous and so violent that it actually stirs up intra-Muslim feelings in the region. And so you have rivals of Egypt in Damascus and in Kerak who are so tired of these guys, they make a very unlikely alliance. They make one with the Christians. They go to the Christian sites and they agree with the Christian community as well as the military religious orders, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, and my favorite, the Knights of St. Lazarus. These are the leper knights. They all make an agreement to join in one military alliance and fight against these Muslim zealots, the Khwarezmians. It's an extraordinary interreligious military alliance in the 13th century that nobody would think about when they think about the period of the Crusades. Now, during that period, in order to cement this alliance, those Muslim rulers from Damascus and Kerak, this is how they sweeten the pot. If you join with us, Christians, and help us drive these zealots out, you can have the Temple Mount back. And so for 1 year, we think, it's a little obscure on the record, for 1 year, the Temple Mount goes back to Christian rule, offered by Muslim war leaders. Now that doesn't last very long because this is not any kind of a happy ending. This grand Muslim-Christian alliance gets destroyed at the Battle of Laforby in October 1244, and after that all bets are off. The city goes back to Islam, and ever since there has been Muslim prayer at the Temple Mount. Most famously in 1967, when the Israelis retake the city of Jerusalem, the Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, is on the Temple Mount, and it is suggested to him that, this is the time, destroy the Muslim holy sites, and we end this problem once and for all. And Dayan says, no, status quo, Muslim prayer only on the Mount. And that has largely held to the present day. If you total it all up, from the beginning of the Muslim entry into Jerusalem to the present day, they have prayed at the Temple Mount for, I calculated this, 97.7% of the last 1,400 years. So again, we have two great stories here, I think. You have continual Muslim prayer at their holy site in Jerusalem. You have continuous Jewish prayer at their Muslim site in Jerusalem. We have two stories that are both defensible on the historical record, and they're not incompatible. They work very well together. In the Middle Ages, you had Muslims up on the Mount praying, and you had Jews praying down below. It was a very common sight. The record is clear on this. Moreover, in the medieval period, we have to think about who granted these rights. Jews were granted religious rights in the city by both Muslim and Christian governments. Muslims were granted religious rights in the city by Christian governments. I think it's a unique and fascinating interreligious story. Okay, so that's great, but here's the problem. Today, it seems more and more as I look at the situation that each side is not emphasizing the coexistence of these two stories. They're only looking at their own story. And they don't interface with the other story at all, even though it's perfectly legitimate on historical grounds. And I think this is the crux of a lot of problems today in the Middle East peace process. So for example, we were talking about, we introduced about October 7th, right? Take the claims of Hamas in the two versions of its charter. In the 1988 original charter, Hamas claims that Jews are merely the latest round of foreign oppressors. They're not indigenous to the land. They are, in effect, and the charter calls them this, the new crusaders, the new Mongols, right? They're coming from the outside, and as such, Hamas says we will deal with them the same way we dealt with the Mongols and with the crusaders, jihad. This is a quote from the charter: there is no solution to the Palestinian problem except by jihad. That's a historical reference, right? Islam defeated those foes before, and they'll do it again. There's no acknowledgement that the Jews were indigenous, once held political power, or were themselves a people with the same story, being oppressed by foreign powers. And in the 2017 revision of the Hamas Charter, Hamas declares that Jerusalem indeed has Christian and Muslim holy sites, but it omits the Jewish holy sites completely. That part of the record disappears. That's Hamas. Okay, but let's look at Israel. We want to be fair here. Israel acknowledges the rule of Muslim sultanates and caliphates in centuries past. It talks about these governments on the board. However, it argues that none of those states had Jerusalem as its capital, as its political capital. They had the city, but not as a capital. And as a result, Muslims cannot lay claim to Jerusalem as a capital because they never had it as such. The Israel retaking of Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, therefore, is a watershed moment that continues to bedevil the question of a Palestinian state. All proposals, and you've heard some of them in the past weeks, that demand a return to pre-1967 borders are non-starters, partially because of the capital question. And again, that's the particular Israeli reading of history. Although I would note there have been proposals that have kicked the idea of East Jerusalem being a Palestinian capital, and those have kind of fallen apart at different points. So two different stories. They could work together, but only if you're reading them both. And right now I get the sense that everybody's reading their own story and they have no interest in reading the others. So I'd like to conclude about this with a sort of a sad lament, because I'm going to tell you about a striking story in the 11th century that I wish was more of the situation in the Middle East today. In the late 11th century, Jerusalem was struggling through bouts of Shia-Sunni violence. They culminate in two sieges of the city in 1073 and, most shockingly, in 1077, when Sunni forces enter the city and kill 3,000 Shia on the Temple Mount. At one point, the violence gets so bad that the sheikh of a Muslim Shafi'i law school, known as a madhab, decides to take his business somewhere else. Jerusalem is getting too violent. Before he leaves the city, he goes to his counterpart, the head of a Jewish rabbinite yeshiva, and tells him, I'm leaving town and I'm bringing my students with me. I'm going to Tyre. Do you want to come? And the head of the Jewish yeshiva says, absolutely. And arm in arm, they grab their students, they grab their books, they leave Jerusalem, and together the members of an Islamic and a Jewish law school relocate to another place because they were so shocked by the violence going on in the city. Now think about that for a second. In the 11th century, in the midst of all this violence, somehow the Muslim and Jewish community found a way to not only get along, but to be partners in their own enterprises. The Middle East is often cast as an intractable problem. It can never be solved, some people say. From my perspective as a medieval historian, I find cause for optimism in the record of the distant past, which I would suggest remains a relevant and even vital consideration in current Middle Eastern affairs. Certainly the major actors in the region say this, as Dr. Steed indicated earlier. It's my hope that someday people will start reading each other's stories more closely and see the commonalities, not the conflict. Turn it back to you.
Okay, so I would like to say that I share Dr. Hostler's optimism, but now I'm going to give you some more recent, some of the roots of conflict that are not as deep, where maybe there's reason for less optimism. Okay, so we're going to go here. So this is, as I was thinking about this presentation, as I was thinking about how to inform my students, I started to come up with, what is the list of things I think people need to know to understand what's going on. And in this case, I chose sort of World War I-ish as my break. I think Dr. Hostler's points are important and critical to understanding the region. But understanding the current political situation, World War I seems to be a logical break. Also, you have to, otherwise it just becomes overwhelming. And so I still have 25, well, technically 26 things, because I call it 25 plus 1. I'm a historian, so I'm not great at math, but that's 26. And for those watching, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all of them, because we don't have time for that today. But I do want to address some of them, and this is getting at this list. So the first section here is called, I titled Competing Promises. And in that we see 3 different promises made by the British Empire to 3 different peoples, where you could argue they're being offered the same land. Okay? So the British government is basically selling the same bridge to 3 different people. They're selling it to the Arabs in the Hussein McMahon correspondence. So this is Sharif Hussein of the Hijaz, and Henry McMahon, who is the British High Commissioner in Cairo. And they're discussing about the Arab revolt, how this should work, and McMahon basically says, I'm in favor of an Arab state, and he kind of lays out the land. Now, in all 3 of these agreements, which are interpreted very differently by the competing parties, you can see, if you read them, the fact that really the British Empire doesn't promise that much. It's a lot of diplomatic double talk, and there's a lot of, well, we're in favor of, like they're not actually selling the land, signing a deed, and making a contract. It's kind of just saying, hey, yeah, we're okay with the idea of the Arabs having this state given this general area. So the same sort of thing is happening in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the discussion is going on between, initially it was between Russian, French, and British, but then as the Russians sort of fall out of this, especially with the Russian Revolution, but even before that, the Russians sort of drop off, and we just get the French and British, which is Mark Sykes and Georges Picot, the 2 diplomats who kind of hash this out. And the idea is the British kind of offer some of the land that they offered to Hussein to the French. Now, again, if you read it, you can see that why the British would say, oh, we're not double dealing, we didn't actually commit to anything anyway. But certainly people in the region, Arabs in the region, feel like once Sykes-Picot becomes well known, that this is an example of the British basically talking out of both sides of their mouth at the same time. And then, of course, in 1917, the famous Balfour Declaration is issued. This is by Arthur James Balfour, who's the Foreign Secretary for the British Empire. And he basically says that the British government looks favorably upon Palestine being a national home for the Jews. That's all it says. It doesn't say homeland, it says home. And it doesn't, again, like there's no contract or signed property issues here. But you can see, or I hope people can see, how it looks like they're offering the same land to multiple people. And to a degree, there was some truth to that, because the British were looking for allies. This was at the height of World War I, 1915, 1916, 1917, where things could go either way on the Western Front. And so Britain was inclined to want assistance. Assistance from the Arabs, assistance from the French, assistance from Jews. So they're offering something to everybody, seemingly making sense, but the British get criticized a lot for this. The other thing to think about comes after World War I. And there's a couple things. One is World War I ends the caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, and that goes away. We'll talk a little bit about that and its importance. But with the end of the Ottoman Caliphate and the League of Nations mandate of Palestine to the British Empire, what you get is an influx of Jewish immigration in the 20s. Now that influx of immigration will start to rise, as most people can imagine, in the 1930s once the Nazis take over in Germany. And so it'll spike in the mid-1930s, and it'll get so bad that there'll be a revolt in Palestine against this immigration and against the mandatory government, the British mandatory government. And the Brits will have to bring in, to include Jordanians and others, folks from all over the empire to help quell this revolt. It'll take them more than 2 years, it's 3 years, and it gets quelled in 1939. And at that point, the British government will offer what they call, well, technically it's not called the White Paper, but most people know it as the White Paper of 1939. And that White Paper says that the British government says no more Jewish immigration. It's not going to stop immediately, but it's going to stop in the very near future. And essentially, you could read into it that they believe the Balfour Declaration has sort of been met. Okay? Now, 1939 should be important to most people watching this, because in September of that year, obviously World War II begins in Europe, and at that point, the Jews realize they're opposed to this White Paper, the Jews in Palestine, but they kind of have no options. Like, they can't oppose the British government because the enemies of the British government is the Germans, right? The Nazi Germans. So they're stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of who to deal with this. And so David Ben-Gurion, who is then the head of the Jewish Agency, makes his famous statement that we will fight the White Paper as if there is no war, and we will fight the war as if there is no White Paper. And this is a huge aspect. So now I'm going to step back in time for a moment. So the Caliphate ends, the Ottoman Caliphate, which ends something like about 1,300 years, it's a little less than that, of caliphal rule. So since the death of the Prophet Muhammad until the dissolution of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924, there is a caliph, sometimes more than one, on earth continuously. And that ends in 1924. And within a few years, you will get a group called the Muslim Brotherhood that will be organized to create a pan-Islamic, it's really sort of pan-Arabic, but with the idea of pan-Islam group, organization, to kind of, in a way, take the place of the loss of the caliph, this singular voice. Now, we can talk all about the Ottomans and whether or not they were truly the singular voice for Islam, because they really weren't, but a lot of people sort of, after their departure was more emotional than their existence, if that makes sense. So more people felt the fact that the caliph was gone than they actually gave respect to the caliph and what the caliph said when he was in existence. And that's kind of important, because the Muslim Brotherhood is the ideological foundation or founding father of Hamas. Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization, so they connect themselves ideologically to the Muslim Brotherhood, and they start in this sort of replacing the caliph thing. Now, it's sort of important, obviously, to talk a little bit about World War II, because you can't talk about the Jewish story and not talk about that. And up here, in quotation marks, it's called solutions. And the reason why is because we'll see two solutions. One, during the war, is the final solution, which is the Nazis' solution to what they see as the Jewish problem in Europe, which is to get rid of all Jews in Europe. And obviously, as most of you will already know, through mass murder and the slaughter of millions of people. After the war, and I want to tell a little story. So if you go to Jerusalem, there's a Holocaust memorial. It's not a museum. It's not like a Holocaust museum that you might see somewhere else. It's a memorial. I kind of equate it to, it's a family mourning its own deceased, as opposed to most Holocaust museums are like a newspaper's obituary about the deceased. It's more factual as opposed to emotional. And so Yad Vashem is this memorial to the Holocaust. And it's built as a museum like a gash in the land, much as the Holocaust is supposed to be a gash in the psyche of certainly the Jewish psyche and more. And so there's a central corridor, but you can't walk all the way down. You have to weave your way. You start right and left and so forth as you go through these different chambers. Most Americans are overwhelmed by the time they get to the second, or it's technically the third to last chamber, because that is the relief of the camps. It's when the American armies, when the Allied armies get to the camp and free the captives. And that's where most Holocaust movies stop. But the most important chamber, and so I went through many times with American military organizations, because the Israel Defense Forces made American military guys always come and visit Yad Vashem. And so I would tell the American guys, like, hey, look, this next chamber is the most important, and it's the second to last one, because it's what happens after the Holocaust, and it's a story almost no American movie or documentary really talks about. So what happens is many of these Jews go home, and I'm doing that with quotation marks because this is the problem. They'll return back to Poland or Russia or wherever their home was, and they'll get there, and many of them will be killed as they try to reestablish their home and their life. Thousands of them, tens of thousands of them will be killed in pogroms of them returning home. And so the problem for Jews, Hitler thought that there was a problem of Jews, but what the post-World War II era reveals is that there is a problem for Jews. What is their home? Where can they go? Where can Jews be safe in the world? And so what will end up happening is the United Nations will sort of get this problem, because the United Nations was actually, by the way, trivia, created, that was the name given to the alliance against Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Okay, so that organization, when it's built in New York City and exists there, they will deal with this problem of what to do with the Jews and where is their home. And then there'll be a partition plan of, and they'll decide to partition Palestine. And they'll come up with an elaborate plan as only the UN can do. And that partition plan looks something like this. So on the left, you see what the actual plan is, and then on the right will basically be what happens after the 1948 war. And so all the Arab countries and Islamic countries reject the partition plan. The Jews in Palestine accept it. American and Soviet influence will get it to pass in the United Nations. And then basically there'll be a trial by combat, where the Arab nations say, we disagree with this, we're going to basically fight this out and decide it by war. And what will end up happening is the Jews will be successful in that war. And as they will actually expand what the Jewish state was, and they'll control more territory after the war than what the partition plan would give them. So that's the 48 war, sort of from the Israeli perspective. But from the Palestinian perspective, they refer to 1948 as al-Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. Now, that term might be familiar to some of you because a lot of Palestinians are currently referring to the events in 2023 as a second Nakba, that this is another catastrophe that's playing out. Now, what the catastrophe is has different meanings over time. So initially, that catastrophe was the ineffectiveness of the Arab states to defeat this one Jewish state. Later, more recently, the way that Nakba is interpreted is the catastrophe of the Jews driving out, ethnically cleansing Arab communities throughout Palestine. And it doesn't happen universally, it's not, but it does happen. And so this is this Nakba versus 48 war. This is, again, two different stories of the same events. Okay, so I now want to skip forward a couple years. Obviously, we're not talking about all this in depth, but I want to go to 1967. So this is a map of before the war on the right and after the war on, before the war on the left, after the war on the right. And so the Jewish state, Israel, is now, feels threatened. It actually launches a preemptive attack. It captures, over the course of 6 days, it's referred to as a 6-day war, what we'll see as Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. These are what are referred to now collectively as the occupied territories. So when people talk about occupation, usually the first reference, although Hamas will refer to everything since 1948 as occupation, but non-Hamas, or really the argument I normally heard before 2023 was that the occupation begins in 1967. That tended to be more common then, but now when you hear occupation, you're probably hearing everything from 48 on. So these occupied territories. So before 67, between 48 and 67, what we call the Gaza Strip today is controlled by Egypt. What we call the West Bank today is controlled by Jordan, and it's part of their territory. And in 67, then Israel takes them from Egypt and Jordan. And then the Golan Heights, it takes from Syria. Now that's kind of how most people talk about this. But one of the things that I think is so important about the 67 war is it is in effect the death of the state action. Now it'll continue on. There'll be another war in 1973 where Arab states are going to fight Israel. But what happens in 1967 for most groups, certainly groups like the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, and others, they will see 67 as the death of the success of Arab nationalism. And now they believe that non-state actors need to take the fore. And so even though you would have Palestinian Liberation Organization attacks, usually they're referred to in the early 60s or the mid-60s as commando raids, those take place before 67, but then they'll get worse after 67 as non-state action becomes more and more important. Now, the other part here that's important in wrapping your head around what's going on is in 1979 we get what the Iranians will tell you is an Islamic revolution in Iran. I refer to it as an Iranian revolution in 1979 because it's almost exclusive to Iran. But in that case, a religious group, a fundamentalist religious group, will take control of a state in the Middle East. And they're Shia, right? And so this is a significant event that shapes the whole region in the Middle East. And it's really important in how it influences everything. Now, over time, and certainly by the time we get to 2023, I would argue there has become, Iran has turned its 1979 Iranian revolution into an Islamic revolution. So Hamas gets most of its funding now from Iran, which should seem weird if you know something of the Muslim Brotherhood, because the Muslim Brotherhood is a Sunni, somewhat fundamentalist group, and the government in Tehran is a Shia, somewhat fundamentalist group. You would think that this is like water and oil, and they shouldn't mix, but they are, partly because of this Islamic revolution that Iran has helped facilitate. Part of that is brought on by the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. I would say even more importantly is the ISIS invasion of Syria and Iraq in 2014 and to the present, where ISIS is still operating in those states. And that has given ISIS's actions, gave Iran credibility throughout the region that they did not enjoy before. One of the things that is important to recognize is during this period, there is, among these various groups, I label them non-state actors for a lot of reasons rather than just terrorists, which they sometimes get. Yes, they'll do terrorism, but terrorism is an approach, it's a tactic, it's a thing that you're doing. It might even be a strategy, but not everything they do is terrorism. Sometimes what they do is a military attack. So I refer to them generically as non-state actors for that reason. And what we'll see is these non-state actors are learning from the West. They learned from Operation Desert Storm in 1991, liberating Kuwait from the Iraqi army. They learn from American and Israeli interactions with these non-state actors over the decades. And they come up with this other approach to how to fight war. And so what they're trying to do is they want to do three things. One is absorption, deterrence, and exhaustion. So they recognize that these powerful actors like Israel and America can throw lots of technology at them. So what the first thing they need to do is be able to absorb that technology. So they use tunnels. They go into cities. So they use the urban population. They use urban infrastructure. So they'll put their rockets and their missiles in apartment buildings, in homes, in schools. Their headquarters in Gaza, for example, is under a hospital. And they do that as part of this absorption. So the intent is to absorb the technology. They also want to deter. And part of what we saw on October 7th is an aspect of using terror, well, to do a couple things. But one is to express what they're willing to do as a form of deterrence, and also to express their willingness to do this forever. Because if they're willing to do it forever, that can be a deterrence as well. And then finally, their goal is to do it long enough to exhaust the will, to make people just tired of fighting in that area. And if you're struggling with what that means, think about how and why America left Afghanistan. Americans were just tired of it. That is exhaustion. And then the other thing I would throw is this aspect, the plus one, is this theory, and it's from the management of savagery. And I've talked about that elsewhere, and I'll let people look it up. But one of the key things that he brings up in this theory of war is, again, this emphasis on exhaustion and a term he calls the deceptive media halo. And the idea, of course, of a halo is it's a symbol of divine power given to somebody, usually because of their purity, but it's divine power. And so the idea is that the West has this power, but it's deceptive power. It doesn't really exist, and it's power granted to them through the media. So we show images of rockets or bombs going through a specific window or hitting a specific car, and it shows it like the finger of God coming down and destroying that object. So it's like we have the power of God, but it's really deceptive and it's not real. And I think that's an important part, again, of what these groups try to communicate, is that we don't really have the power of God, that Israel doesn't have the power of God, that they are weak because they don't have the power of God, and that this is given to them by this media halo that's offered, or this deceptive media halo. Okay, so let me go to this general rules. Okay, so I talked to my students at the Command and General Staff College about this a lot. I talked to them, right now, it's obvious to everybody why they should care about the Middle East. But there for a couple of years, everybody's, it's all about Ukraine, and that's what really matters, and we shouldn't think about the Middle East. And even before that. So I've been talking about the Middle East is important for a long, long time. So for those of you who are old school, I'm going to refer back to Don Felder, Don Henley, and Glenn Fry, and the Hotel California. Okay, so why should we care about the Middle East? Because the Middle East is, for America, our Hotel California. Because we can check out anytime we want, but we can never leave. And they say earlier that we are prisoners here of our own device. Now, we could talk a different reason about why that is. But for whatever reason, whether you like it or not, we are in the Middle East. And so we need to not check out. We need to not check out intellectually. We need to not check out in terms of our study and our paying attention to the region, because even if this recent stuff is going to boil down, something's going to come back. It's not going to go away. So the key things here, obviously, one, I want everybody to see the pyramid, or at least see more than their square or their triangle. So that's an important thing. The other part, Dr. Hostler brought up about Hamas's charter. We could talk about the Iranian declarations. Believe them when they say what they say. They mean what they say. They're not joking. Like this, they're in this for the long haul. And I would say that's both sides. Believe the Jews in Israel when they say what they say. They are not going away. Both sides are committed to this fight. This is part of the challenge. And then the other part is, this is not World War II. Hopefully, October 7th shocked some people out of how they thought war was fought, but it is not Operation Desert Storm. It is not even our initial invasion of Iraq that seemed to go so clean and bloodlessly. If this war goes on, and again, these guys are both committed to it, it's going to be bloody. That's a part of the reality. And then the other part I would say is, it's on us, when I say about don't check out, that we have to do our homework. So I will end with that, and then now to questions.
As I said at the outset, we solicited questions through our social media channels in advance, and picked up a couple from our online audience. Are the Arabs, the Palestinians, native to what is now Israel, and what constitutes natives?
Do you want? You can jump on that first, and then I've got just a random thought about it.
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. Certainly, from the 7th century forward, you have Arab presence in the land, a formal political presence, right? But you also clearly have Arabs in the region that are not part of any kind of major polity. So, for example, when the Rashidun does move into the region, the Byzantines actually have Arabic allies who fight with them, right? So you don't have people that are just living in one place here and here. There's so much movement, so much permeability. This is a land, the Near East, where you don't have firm borders. You have frontiers, really, and you have people moving back and forth across those. If you think of the Bedouin, for example, and they're nomadic and they're moving around, and the rise and fall of states. And so I tend to think if you're trying to locate any one particular group, then you have to be very specific about what your standards are for that. What are you looking for? What is the criteria that needs to be met? Certainly the Arabs have a very, very long tradition in the region. The Jews have a very, very long tradition in the region. Because the Jews have the older documents, it's easier to trace them further back than we can with the Arabs. But even then, I'm hesitant to say that anyone has a particular origin claim that's better, because the people are so scattered, the written record is so loose and so arguable. I prefer to say that simply both are ancient peoples in the same land.
And maybe because of that vagueness, it might be difficult to answer this follow-up question. Is the expulsion of native inhabitants ever justified?
Well, we've done that throughout history. No one, it just gets into what is native. So if I go back 500 years, nobody who lived there was the original inhabitant there, or 200 years, or 300, like everybody has moved around. Whether it's whether it's in Germany or Poland. We were talking in class today about the Polish border, moving left and right and people moving. So sometimes this notion of whose land it is, it all goes into, well, sort of one of my favorite lines, and it gives back to this deep roots versus roots of conflict. It's where do you draw the line? So one of the things I want to go with the original question is fascinating. So when I visited Lebanon, the Lebanese will make the argument that they are Phoenician, and they draw their cultural connections to the Phoenicians of the 200s BC, 300 BC, 400 BC, those guys who were sailing all over the Mediterranean, that stuff. There was a group, I don't know who they were connected with, that did a genetic testing of the Lebanese and then the Arabs further inland in Syria and elsewhere. And guess what? They're basically genetically the same people. So does it matter whether they're genetically, Bedouin Arabs, like that's who they're connected to, or does it matter what their cultural connection is? Like they think they're Phoenician and therefore they act differently than those Bedouins in the desert. And it goes also, Abraham was a Bedouin. The children of Israel were Bedouins wandering around the desert. So there's some cultural and historical links. It's just kind of interesting what people claim in the region and what they will connect to. A lot of times it's much more cultural than it is historical or genetic, if we want to go down a more scientific route.
And this touches on your closing, this question. What is the United States' interest in providing aid to Israel?
Okay. So I don't think we said this. So I want to emphasize at this point that we are not speaking on behalf of the United States government or the United States Army Command and General Staff College. This is Brian Steed's opinion. We've had, since 7 October, there have been a lot of discussions, and I've had former students, former colleagues ask questions about what my thoughts are on this. And so I've had times to kind of process it a little bit. But one of the things that's important, and people who don't recognize this, I think, are being simplistic about it. America is recognized, if I ask Jordanians, and when I served in the Jordanian army, I would get asked all the time to explain American policy, and why do we back Israel for this, and why are we doing that? And I got asked that almost every day I lived in Jordan. And so to most Arabs, most Middle Easterners looking at our relation with Israel, they see Israel as almost like our 51st state. If you were to ask them a question, do we have a closer connection to Israel or to Puerto Rico? Almost everybody in the Middle East would say Israel. Okay, and I hope the listening and viewing audience recognizes it should be Puerto Rico. But that isn't how it's seen in the Middle East. So if we abandon Israel now, if we're perceived as abandoning Israel now, after what happened in Afghanistan 2 years ago, after what might be perceived currently as an abandonment of our commitment to Ukraine, like Israel is considered to be our longest strategic partner, certainly in the Middle East. And even though there's a lot of Arab countries who are making voices, or not actually, Middle Eastern countries, not Arab countries, that are making voices like they really don't like this relationship, they would actually be more negatively affected if we abandon Israel now than if we keep with them. Even though they would argue that, hey, the Palestinians' issues need to be dealt with. And I think that this is a point most Americans don't understand, is what that relationship is. And I'm not arguing either in favor of it or against it. That's just how it is. And I'm not a realist when it comes to international relations, but I am a pragmatist. And there is a world that we live in, and abandoning our relationship with Israel would affect this world today in a very real way.
How can, I'm sorry, John, did you have anything to add?
No, I'm happy to reveal my ignorance of those modern issues and stay back in the medieval past.
How can the U.S. continue to claim support and uphold human rights while it fully funds, with no red lines, attacks on Palestinian civilians?
There's a nuanced answer to this that I don't think a lot of people are going to be happy with. If you are paying attention to what is being said, because I'll tell you on the Israel side, they are not happy with how America has supported them. Like, they feel like we have been quite equivocating in our support. Now, obviously on the Palestinian side, I think that question is more in line with a Palestinian perspective. And so I think the American government would say, hey, look, we are trying to get help refugees. We're trying to help civilians. We're encouraging, issues with civilians. So I think that there's, well, and the other thing I know the Israelis would argue against is they would say they are not targeting civilians. So the very premise of that question, they would argue it. I completely understand the other side and why they say they are. But this is also a tactic that both Hezbollah did in 2006 and still does, where Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS did this as well. They put their weapons in amongst the civilians. And the civilians know it, and in many cases approve and agree to it. So this is this conundrum that America faced when we were helping the Iraqis recapture Mosul. We had to go through this problem. This was a problem the Israelis had to deal with in 2006 in southern Lebanon. And now this is going to be a problem in Gaza, of how do you discriminate attacking the weapon from the civilians, who in many cases are only one wall away from the weapons. And so this is not a simple issue.
Why does the U.S. continue to support the occupation of Palestine?
I would think that that's a question best asked for the U.S. government. But I think one of the things that is interesting is, I'd love to ask that question, what do they mean by the occupation of Palestine? Are they going back to 1948? Are they going back? So one of the things that's fascinating, and I ask my students this all the time, who owns the land? Is it the person who holds the piece of paper, or the person who lives on and works the land? Now, in Western cultures, it's the person who holds the piece of paper, that deed, that property. Okay, so when one of the dynamics is there are Palestinians who've been working land that is now occupied by, I'm sure, the questioner's definition, for centuries, maybe. or certainly more than a century, that their family's been working that land for generations. But they probably never owned that land, but they've been working it, because that land was probably owned by an absentee landlord under the Ottoman Empire. And that might have been an absentee landlord who lived in Damascus. And then maybe he sold the property to some absentee landlord who lived in Istanbul or Ankara or maybe in Sidon or somewhere else, Jerusalem maybe even. And that never mattered to the family that was working the land because the landlord wasn't there. Now, what changes with Jewish immigration is when Jews buy the land, Jews want to live on and work the land. And so it isn't the first time, because there's been displacement with land purchases throughout this history, as long as there have been deeds and land agreements. But in a larger way, the Jewish immigration is a significant influx, particularly in the mid-30s when it gets, as they're running away from Nazi Germany in big numbers. Then you're seeing people buying land and displacing Palestinians by the hundreds and by the thousands. And that is what angers the Palestinians. Now, is that occupation? And this is that problem of what people consider occupation. From a Western standard, no. If you bought the land, you own the land. You're not occupying the land at that point. And so each of these, whether it's the 20s and 30s, or the 48 war and the Nakba, or the 67 war, each of these can be, depending on the groups, Hamas would call the purchases in the 20s and 30s part of this occupation. So it's a different standard, and it matters what is the occupation and why might someone support one thing versus the other.
I would piggyback on that and say I agree with the analysis. And if you look further back, you have similar questions, really. What constitutes ownership? What constitutes a transfer of things? Although in the earlier period, it's very again, standards are always different as you go back. As one culture looks at it in their own time. So one that I deal with a lot in my teaching and the electives I teach at CGSC is the Crusaders who are going to the east to reclaim this land. And you ask the question, well, who does the land belong to? Well, it depends on who you ask. They would say, well, this land is Christian land because it was owned by the Roman Empire, which was Christian. Ergo, it's ours. We're the Christians. We're the inheritors of this land. Conveniently forgetting that there was a claimant before the Romans ever came called the Jews, right? And so there's this deliberate process in what we call the disinheritance of the Jews over time, in which you make the argument, well, the Jews used to own the land, but they have forfeited that claim to the land, usually because of a role that's impugned upon them in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So the old covenant, broken, there's now a new covenant with the Christians, the Jews are out, we're in, right? And again, it's not purchasing land per se, but they would say, we have acquired ownership of it, it has transferred to us. The Jews being out of power are in no position to say any different, even though they're saying it in their own documents, but they can't say it with any kind of political force. And I think you can make some comparisons, say, when a group of people that is out of power has a complaint about ownership, it can fall on deaf ears for practical purposes. It doesn't look like they own the land. They don't have the ability to politicize and to pick up any means of acquiring it. They may not have the military capability either. And so it seems like one is legitimate because there's a capital and there's an embassy and there's the deeds and it all makes sense. Whereas the other group was out of power to begin with and really negotiating from a lower position from the get-go. And so that's the sort of pre-modern things I see. And of course, the Muslims disagree entirely, and they say, well, now it's ours, right? It doesn't matter if it was Christian land or Jewish land before. By virtue of conquest, it is now ours. And that's another standard that you can have for land ownership, which gets back to the idea of indigenous peoples and moving people off of land. We tend to forget this because our modern world, we eschew wars of conquest. We don't like them. They make us very uncomfortable. We like the idea of sovereign borders. But for most of world history, conquest is the model. And the army that takes the land is the new possessors, and you don't need a deed to enforce that.
Couple of final questions. Do the Palestinian people have a right to self-defense, and what might that look like given the massive imbalance of power?
when you ask, do they have a right of self-defense? I think the obvious answer is yes, because every person does. But this is, okay, so I'm going to answer this by not answering it. So, I mean, you said this in the introduction. I consider it a tremendous privilege to serve in the Jordanian army for several years. And as part of that, I got to meet with and talk with Palestinians on many occasions. And regularly, I would walk away and be like, wow, they're right. I also had the privilege of working and living in Israel and getting to meet some really profound individuals and articulate individuals. And I would hear their arguments. And I would walk out of that room and go, wow, they're right. And what I learned as an American is, like, Americans want the simple answer. We want to know who wears the white hat, who wears the black hat. Who do I root for? Who's John Wayne and who's, the bad guy? I'm not thinking the right John Wayne movie of who the bad guy is in that. Anyway, like, that's what we kind of want. And what I would simply offer is that doesn't exist in this case. They are both right. And by that, I mean like almost 100%. That if you listen to their arguments and they lay it out to you, they are both right. And I'm talking in this case Palestinians and Israelis. I'm not talking Hamas, nor what they did on 7 October, because I set that completely aside from this discussion. So, one, they're both right. Or you could equally say they're both wrong. And what I would love for listeners and viewers to kind of get a sense of is there is no simple answer. This is a complex environment that goes back hundreds of years, arguably thousands of years, because John didn't even bring up the Israelis dispossessing the Canaanites of the land. And we could go back and back and back. And again, it's where do you draw the line? And I would tell every audience member, don't draw the line on 7 October 2023. It's more complicated than that. But I would also love people to have both images, be able to see both the square and the triangle at the same time. Recognize that two things can be true at once. That what Hamas did on 7th October is heinous and should be criticized roundly and without reservation. And at the same time, we should be able to also say we need to figure out how to establish a Palestinian environment where they can actually have some level of self-actualization, where they can be a people with a state, right? Like, how can both of those things happen simultaneously? And it bothers me that everybody's either taking one side or the other, and it is not that simple.
Finally, under international law, what are the measurements for proportionality? And what accusations of war crimes might stand up to scrutiny?
Okay, so I have two lawyer students. I don't know how many you have.
Yeah.
And so this has actually come up, and we've been talking about this. So one, I'm not a military lawyer, nor, I will remind everybody watching this, are almost any of the commentators that you're listening to. Okay, they don't know what they're talking about when they're slinging the term war crimes around, because there's a lot of things that probably would shock people that are not war crimes. For example, it is a war crime to store weapons in a protected site. That is wrong. So if you're putting weapons in a mosque, whether that's the ammunition or the firing position, that is wrong. You're not supposed to do that because that's supposed to be a protected site. And by using a protected site, you actually remove from it that protection. It is now okay for somebody to strike that site. Now, the problem, and this is part of what genuinely bothers me, well, I don't know, maybe it's a really good thing. So I guess I'm confused with myself on this issue. But Americans do not really know what war is. War is horrible. War is brutal. I tell my students that all war, the very concept of war, is a crime. Everything you do in a war, if you do that in Kansas City, you will be arrested. Like almost everything. We had guys who would ram cars to get out of their way. Well, if I am annoyed with cars on 435, I can't ram them. You would arrest me and put me in jail. And you should, right? But in war, I can do those sorts of things because now my rules are a little bit different. I'm protecting myself and so forth. So again, this is much more complicated, and it's worth listening and to people who actually know about the nuances. And most people will not be happy with the answers, because what you're allowed to do in war is things that most human beings, and maybe rightfully so, are not going to be happy with. Okay, war is ugly. And I don't say that, by the way, let me make it clear. I don't say that in praise of war, right? Like, I mean, like, it is ugly and I don't like it. That's why I want there never to be war.
One final question.
Yes, talk about the power of nonviolence.
They're charters, groups committed to violence, as opposed to groups committed to peaceful change. And so that's a dynamic that changes within the Palestinian environment.